Welcome, everyone. Welcome on behalf of BICO, the British Institute for International and Comparative Law, to the distinguished panel and to the attendees. This webinar, the title is Global Governance at the Crossroads, is really timely. Shortly after the conclusion of the Ministerial Conference, our distinguished speakers chaired by an equally panel of distinguished speakers chaired by an equally distinguished chair, Professor Gabriel Marceau, will discuss some of the outcomes of the Ministerial Conference, shedding light on what were the achievements, but also what are the challenges ahead. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Professor Marceau, and thanking again the speakers for accepting the invitation and for agreeing to share their thoughts in this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Julinda, and thank you to BICO for organizing this conference. Thank you to Manhi, who also helped connecting and contacting the panelists. It's a special webinar for me today, not only because we have 4 outstanding sort of real world top experts, but these are all people with whom I've worked and friends. So it should be a quite intense exchange, because I hope it will be frank and deep on substance. So they don't need introduction, but I'll say 2 words on first my big boss, DDG Annabelle Gonzalez, who you all know, but besides being DDG, besides having been an outstanding actor in this positive result, DDG Gonzalez was before Foreign Trade Minister for Costa Rica. She was VP at the World Bank. In the WTO, she was Director of Agriculture and Commodities, and she's been also in the Peterson think tank. We have another Gonzalez lady, Arantxa, who was also a big boss of mine, as she was at some point chief of staff of the WTO, including when I was under her in the cabinet and DG Lamy. And just before a few months back, she was Minister of Foreign Affairs in Spain. She was the DG of ITC and also a long time at the Commission. We have also Patrick Lowe. Dr. Patrick Lowe was chief economist of the WTO for years. He's now at the University of Hong Kong, and he was chief of staff under DG Mike Moore. And finally, Steve Coe from Aiken Gum, a law firm very much involved in WTO matters. Steve, before being in this law firm, was at USTR, Associate General Counsel, and acting Chief Counsel on China's enforcement. So I'm sure you agree with me that it's a spectacular team. So what the way we'll proceed today is they will each say share with us their perspective for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a second round of comments where they will comment on each other and ask questions. Before I go to Annabelle, just to remind you, the MC12 result, the so-called Geneva package, is made of 2 main parts. The first one is called the outcome documents, and we'll talk about it. It includes a series of principles, including on WTO reform, on development, on difficulties such as an accession, on the multilateral system. And together with and attached with this umbrella outcome document, you have sort of 9 decisions, 7 main plus 2 smaller decisions, including the fishery subsidies decision and others. So the way we proceed, as I mentioned, each will talk about their perspective, and then we'll engage into exchange between the panelists and with me, and of course with you. And the participants You're welcome to send questions in the Q&A right away. I will ask questions. I may grab some of your questions and let's make it as interactive as possible. So if it's fine with you, Annabelle, you were instrumental on the TRIPS waiver. You were instrumental on many, many dimensions. You were right there. What can you share with us?
Thank you very much, Gabriel, to you, to Jolinda, to Bickel for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to join this great panel. Let me start by saying that in the case of our recent ministerial conference, MC12, as we call it, expectations were low, but the stakes were high. Success, even if moderate, was critical. And failure to deliver, I think, would have been devastating for the WTO, but also for multilateral trade cooperation more generally. So against this backdrop, it was very encouraging to see ministers stepping up to the plate at the ministerial and delivering on nearly everything we had been working on. At the start of the session, I have to confess that we were expecting maybe one or two deliverables, and instead we got more than 6, closer to 9, as you were mentioning, Gabriel. And the outcome, turns out to be not only numerous but important, and they address pressing issues faced by people and businesses in today's world, from the lingering pandemic and the looming food crisis to the health of our oceans and the digital transition. So those outcomes are what I think we can say like the most visible part of the ministerial success, but they're not the full story. In fact, I see the outcomes falling into 3 categories: the tangible, the intangible, and the innovative. And if I may, I'd like to say a word on each one of them. First are the tangible outcomes, and I'd like to highlight a few of them. On the response to the pandemic, the most important part and highly contentious is the outcome that clarifies and streamlines the scope for governments to limit patent rights for COVID-19 vaccines to help diversify manufacturing capacity and provide an avenue to export vaccines to countries in need. It is a solution-oriented outcome that can complement the broad set of trade, investment, and regulatory actions that are needed to achieve more geographically diversified vaccine production capacity, more resilient supplies, and more equitable access. The other part of the pandemic-related outcome adopted by ministers addresses trade measures such as export restrictions, trade facilitation, and regulatory cooperation to keep trade in vital medical products open and supply chains running in this and future pandemics. On food insecurity, members agreed to exempt the World Food Programme's food purchases from export curbs, and they took steps to make trade in food, fertilizer, and other agricultural inputs easier and more predictable, which is especially important in times like now, when global supplies are tight and high prices threaten poor households around the world. On digital trade, members committed not to impose customs duties on electronic transmissions, which means that electronically transmitted trade, from movies to music, ebooks, software, financial transactions, and all digitally delivered business services can continue to move freely across borders. In this case, failure to agree on the moratorium, which has been in place since 1998, would have been a double blow to the global services and digital economy, including the millions of jobs and businesses that depend on it worldwide, and also to the WTO and its efforts to bring its rulebook up to date. Now, turning to the issue of sustainability, WTO members successfully concluded, for the first time in the 28-year history of the organization, an agreement whose main purpose is to contribute to environmental sustainability. The agreement prohibits subsidies for illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing operations, and for fishing of overexploited stocks, and it prohibits subsidies for fishing on the high seas that are not managed by regional fisheries bodies. This is, I think, a very significant outcome, not just for the fish, but for the millions of people around the world who depend on fish for food and income. Now, the fishery subsidies agreement also contains robust transparency notification requirements, which I think will be instrumental in giving us much needed data as we negotiate even more rigorous obligations down the road. And it also addresses the need of developing and least developed countries by creating a funding mechanism to help them implement their obligations and undertake fisheries management regimes to develop their industries in a sustainable way. Now, on this point of sustainability, I think we also have another significant, though perhaps less noticed outcome. And it was the recognition in the outcome document that you referred to, Gabriel, of the three planetary crises of our time: climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, and also of the role of the multilateral trading system in helping to tackle them. And this is the first time that climate change and other environmental challenges are explicitly mentioned in a multilaterally agreed declaration at the WTO, signaling what I think is a growing appetite by all members to engage more proactively and constructively on this critical issue at the WTO. And then, of course, there is arguably the most important outcome of all, the decision by ministers to set in motion their work to reform the WTO. And that means, as you all know, addressing all WTO functions: negotiations, deliberation, and monitoring, and dispute settlement. The outcome explicitly recognizes the urgency of addressing the challenges and concerns related to dispute settlement, including the appellate body, so that we can have a fully and well-functioning dispute settlement system by 2024. So these are like the highlights of what I call the tangible outcomes. But I also have a second basket of outcomes, which is made of what I call the intangibles. And this does not mean that they are less important than the tangible outcomes I just mentioned. To the contrary, I think they are critical to building the WTO of the future. And the first relates to trust. So going into the ministerial, the level of trust among members looked decisively low, and nobody knew exactly how geopolitical rift would play out during the conference. And yet, amid geopolitical headwinds, ministers were able to carve out a space for multilateral consensus building, however small, which I think is remarkable. And that, of course, does not mean that we have turned the page on years of mistrust between members. But I now see a more fertile ground to overcome the trust deficit and develop a stronger sense of common purpose among WTO members. And I think this will be essential if we are to make progress on the task of reforming the WTO. The other issue I would like to highlight is confidence in multilateralism. The ministerial came at a pivotal and fragile time for the global trading system, burdened as it is with overlapping and compounding crisis and threat. So failure to deliver would have dealt a serious blow to the prospects of the WTO reform, putting the future of the organization at risk. Success, on the other hand, has given a shot of confidence to the organization after years of gloom, and ministers actually managed to push back against the perception that multilateral trade cooperation has run its course. I think that success breeds success, and the confidence that we gain at the ministerial will stand us in good stead to deliver even more in the future. Another result in the intangibles basket is this renewed sense among WTO members that pragmatism and compromise can make a real difference. And in fact, that they're the only ways to move multilateral cooperation forward. And you know, when ministers started to arrive in Geneva for the conference, positions were still very far apart on many issues, from fishery subsidies to agriculture and from e-commerce to the pandemic response. But as the days went by, we started seeing, I think, genuine give and take and serious efforts to seek a middle ground. And this sort of newfound pragmatism, if you wish, and ability to compromise, I think was in full display in several parts of the MC12, but in particular in the decision to take an incremental rather than an all or nothing approach to dealing with the fishery subsidies issues. Now, this pragmatism and willingness to compromise means that we did not get everything that was expected. But it also means that we got something rather than nothing. And that, I think, as I've said, is very important for the future of the organization, particularly as we embark on an ambitious process of WTO reform. Now, the third and last basket of outcomes I want to talk about is made up of innovations. And let me give you a few examples. First, in the intellectual property decision, there is what I call an inconspicuous footnote, footnote 1, the purpose of which is to define the countries that can benefit from the flexibilities included in the intellectual property deal. In doing so, it creates an opt-out mechanism that could serve as a blueprint for dealing with a very thorny issue, which is the differentiation among WTO's increasingly diverse membership. Footnote 1 was jointly negotiated by the United States and China, and unsurprisingly, it was the last piece of the ministerial to fall into place. Now, that opt-out could work in two ways, I think. First, it supports the adoption of responsibilities by emerging markets in the global trading system. While the footnote declares that all developing countries are eligible, it also encourages countries with existing capacity to manufacture COVID-19 vaccines to make a binding commitment to opt out of the decision. And this is what China did. Second, the opt-out in footnote 1 of the intellectual property decision also works to facilitate multilateral outcomes by allowing those members that cannot join a particular outcome to stay out, bringing much needed flexibility to the global trading system. And I'll be glad to talk more about it maybe later during the program. Now, another innovation I wanted to briefly highlight is the sunset clause in the fish subsidies agreement. That sunset clause says that the whole agreement lapses if a more comprehensive deal is not achieved within 4 years of entry into force or members agree to keep it. So the sunset clause provides, in my view, a powerful incentive to build on and supplement the existing agreement with comprehensive disciplines. So let me briefly conclude by saying that MC12 is, in my view, a positive step, but it is only a first step towards revitalizing the WTO and rebuilding this trust among members, a road which I am sure will continue to be bumpy, rocky, and unpredictable. The results we saw open the door to new and exciting opportunities, I think, to make the global trading system more resilient, more inclusive, and more responsive to the needs of the people worldwide. So let me stop here, Gabriel, and thanks again.
Thank you, Annabelle. I'll come back with questions when you come back, but to me, it's quite impressive, just the last two comments you made about innovation. But let's go to Patrick, very experienced in trade matter for many years. Well, how do you see the results of MC12, Patrick? What is your perspective, your assessment of the overall results of MC12? Please.
Thank you, Gabrielle, and thank you very much to BIICL for the invitation to participate in this event. I'm going to be possibly a little more sanguine about some of the things that happened and didn't happen, and I think this would be very good for the discussion. But first, let me say that, as you from the outside, you never quite know what's going on inside, but I was convinced by Wednesday night, when this was supposed to finish, that we were done for, that there wasn't going to be a result. And I think what happened in the next 2 days was remarkable and really avoided a situation where the WTO would have, WTO membership would have simply walked away without anything. And I think it took 2 more days of very hard work and commitment, which in itself was revealing, by WTO members and the Director General. There's been a lot written about this, mostly in blogs and short articles. I don't think I've seen any solid, systematic analyses yet of what's there and what it might mean for the economy and for the trading system. But I think these assessments tend to fall into glass half full, glass half empty kind of distinction. I think the glass half full rightly emphasizes the systemic significance of achieving a multilateral outcome when one looked quite difficult to attain for quite a long time prior to MC12. And I think this view also acknowledges that at least in some outcomes, there had to be a paring back in order to get agreement. But that's the essence of what it's about. The half-empty glass approach tends to emphasize what one of my former colleagues who blogs described as a cacophony of rattling tins being kicked down the road, which is kind of amusing, but perhaps a little harsh. Suggesting also that there's little that requires just domestic legislative action, and so that sort of speaks for itself in a way. That's at least an argument I've seen, and that the mother lode of benefits from further multilateral cooperation remains to be mined. So I think on a generic level, the most significant feature of the MC12 outcome was that when it comes to the crunch, the consensus-based multilateral action is still possible. However, notable that the old habit of depriving members and participants of sleep in extremis, probably of adequate sustenance, seem to be preconditions for getting to yes. That's painful, it's tough. Could that ever be any different? I don't know. But I think also that if you look at some of the specifics here, for me, honestly, and I remember saying this before, but it looked pretty bleak, the whole thing. I said, for me, if only they got a clear mandate to have a serious, structured discussion on WTO reform and on dispute settlement reform, getting the system to work again, they would have achieved a non-negligible and important outcome. That was kind of where I was coming from. Well, they did that and quite a bit more. So I think that deserves recognition, even if there was paring back in the last hours of the exercise. I think it's really important that those two things now are subject to a mandate and a reporting back requirement. And if there's failure on that, it'll be plain for everybody to see because there's a commitment to do it. And that's important. I think, as in Bali, this is my sense, and I'm quite happy to be contradicted by people who were closer to this. My sense is that a key element, as in Bali, was that the US and China decided that they had common interests in making this work. And I mean, they're the two giants in the picture. I mean, the EU is obviously really important too, but they tend to be the peacemaker and the bridge, mostly. So that's a really important element. And if that hadn't happened, possibly it wouldn't have occurred. So can we take any lessons from that? Can they take any lessons from that? I think also fisheries is really notable. Of course, fisheries really focused on trying to discipline subsidies in respect of particular activities. What would have been better, what would have been more complete, and what would have been more effective is control of subsidies, discipline on subsidies, on the specific things that are subsidized, like capacity enhancing subsidies and harmful subsidies, capital costs of fishing paraphernalia, running costs, current costs, tax exemptions. I think that's where that's where it'll have to go next. That you say very specifically, it's not just that you can't fish in one particular kind of fishing or where fish, but you must stop subsidizing these things and reduce the whole fishing enterprise to a more sustainable level. I think also that I agree with Annabelle that the deadline for termination is more of a threat than just a simple deadline. It says, you know, if you guys don't get your act together, you've got nothing. I don't think anyone wants nothing. So it's an interesting, I haven't seen that done before like that. But either you make progress or you forget it, unless you decide that you can't make progress and you'll agree anyway to put it together. I thought that was neat. But I think fishing subsidies is very important, but pity it didn't go further. It is the first time that the system's taken a sustainability issue seriously. And I think it's good also for another reason. I think the WTO is in for some trouble and some real challenge with what's coming down the road in the form of border tax adjustment issues, CBAM. Right now, it's hard to see how this is going to, how you're going to square this, how this is going to be squared away. There's a lot of work to do there. It's potentially highly contentious. So this is good because it means that at least having addressed one of these issues that really does matter in terms of something much more than trade. Trade, after all, we should always remember, trade is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. Preserving the planet is an end in itself. So the imperative is obvious, and the failure to address it is hugely problematic. So I think fish is really, really important. I think a lot of the other outcomes on food security, e-commerce, MISMEs, SPS are really good. I don't see them quite as centerpieces necessarily, but important nevertheless, and a favorable signal of what is possible. I think, having said all that, in much less detail than Annabelle, I think there are certain challenges that we need to consider. One is, frankly, if you look at the last few years, particularly I would say since the last US administration, the US has disengaged quite significantly. Either the US engages, so the US engaged sufficiently to get this done, to get MT12 done, but the old role of the US seems to have been somewhat absent for some years now. And I think either we learn to do without it, or the US revives its interest and commitment in leading the system. I think also one of the interesting questions that arose, and puzzled me, perhaps Annabelle will explain later, there was a plea from the Director General not to allow any cross-conditionalities. Each issue was to be dealt with in its own terms. No discussions of linkages and trade-offs. That's unique. I've never seen or heard that before. The standard wisdom of all this is that you broaden the scope of the menu and the prospects for success if trade-offs and different interests can be traded for one another, rather than saying you just got to deal with all of these one by one. This may have been a factor, a temporal consideration, I don't know, but I think that's a really interesting question because it's kind of systemic. I think another challenging issue is, of course, agriculture. Agriculture has always been the bane of the system for as long as I can remember. We certainly got some good stuff on food security, as good as one could have expected, but all the rest, there's an awful lot else in that package. There's an awful lot else that makes life difficult for every other part of the system. Less than 5% of everything in the countries that are the ones who are most resistant to change, and something that's very interesting and important for a lot of less developing countries. How can we get through that and get around that? And I mean, we got some progress in the Uruguay round, but again, that was very much because of trade-offs.
Patrick,
yeah.
Can I ask you maybe to keep things, because you've been going on for 15 minutes.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I always lose
Don't
track
be
of
sorry.
time. Can I just
And-
make the last point that I want to make? Or not? You want me to stop now?
Go ahead.
Only that. One of the things that this hasn't been discussed at all, and wasn't in quite appropriately, quite naturally, was not in the MC12 package, is decision making. Consensus is veto, which has been a real problem. And in 2017, at the 11th Ministerial, they started developing these joint statement initiatives. Where's that going to fit in the system? How are we going to arrange that? Without that, I think the WTO is in trouble, but with it, it's not free of difficulties and challenges either. With that, I'll stop, and I'm sorry if I overshot.
No, that's all right. In fact, it may be part of WTO reform. We'll get back to this. Just a small story. I was told that during the Uruguay round, because you made reference to all these nights without sleep, to force a deal between EU and US, the Canadian negotiator, Germain Denis, put them in the room, close the windows, no water, lock the door. So I went to see him a few years ago and I said, is it true that you locked in EU, EC and US negotiators? He said, no, I just lost the key. So there were real efforts to force negotiators physically, whether in small green room or this one. So sleep deprivation and similar actions can work. On this, I'll go to Arantxa. Arantxa, everybody knows her. Of course, she also has a very, very broad sort of set of experience in international economic relations, including foreign minister. Arantxa, what is your take on MC12? What was done, what remains to be done? Please.
Well, thank you very much, Gabriel, and thank you to the BIICL for putting this seminar together. I'm going to try and to take a little bit of altitude and place this ministerial in a context. And the context is because I think it's only when you place it in the right context that you also give it the right value. And you can then judge whether what was achieved was big, was medium, was small. You have to look at the context. And the context is one of multilateralism under huge stress. Now, the stress is not new. The stress was there before. There were, and I like to refer to a few moments in the recent past where we've seen a lot of this stress at play. We saw this I mean, again, it's not specific of this ministerial, but, you know, I like to look at what are the reasons for this stress. And I think there are a few reasons that may help us explain and put into context the WTO ministerial. In my view, the most important reason for the stress is that the main stakeholders in the multilateral system don't share the views about what multilateralism should be about. For some, the current system, the current multilateral system, and I'm not referring specifically about the trading one, but the multilateral system, the rules-based international order was built by somebody else and they do not have a lot of ownership and they want to change it. For some others, the system is a bit too constraining. It's putting too many limitations onto them, and they would like a system that gives them a little bit more flexibility because they think that they need the flexibility in order to navigate better the current circumstances. For a vast majority, nevertheless, multilateralism is crucial to be able to have a place in an international scene where they have individually little power to shape the system. So the expectations and the starting points for them are very different. And this is what has caused a lot of tensions in the recent past. Now, these tensions have accelerated, I would suggest, with the presidency of Donald Trump in the US. And I want to refer specifically to that presidency because I think it meant a big turnaround for a country that is systemic. So this is why I want to refer specifically to this presidency, because it was under this presidency that we saw the US exit major multilateral agreements, whether it was the Paris Climate Change Agreement, whether it was the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, whether it was UNESCO, and whether now that it's also happening, threatening even with exiting NATO. So the feeling of disenfranchising with the multilateral system, as expressed under that president, was important, and we have to look at it carefully. We also saw, as relates to trade more particularly, the use and abuse of exceptions in the international rules relating to trade that had never been used before in this manner, like, for example, the use and abuse of security provisions, national security provisions in international trade, or the adoption of unilateral trade measures for reasons that were difficult to justify. So again, that was one flashpoint, recent flashpoint, where multilateralism was under I would say, a big attack. Second is the pandemic. We've seen in the pandemic also how difficult it has been to articulate multilateral responses to what is in obvious need of a global response, given that the global response would only be the most effective one. And we saw how at the beginning of this pandemic, whether it was on purchasing vaccines or purchasing masks or protective equipment, the first reaction of countries was to do it first for their nationals and then, see what would happen with the rest, even if the rest was as threatening as their own nationals, given that we were confronting a pandemic. And this, that is true for goods, was also true for access to finance, with many countries having enormous difficulties to access finance to stimulate their economies, because the effort at putting together an international response on access to credit was short. And now, more recently, the nail in the coffin, war in Ukraine, war by, let's not forget, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, a nuclear power, breaking what's most sacrosanct in international relations, in the international system that we live in, which is sovereignty and territorial integrity. So this is the backdrop. This is what gives us the measure of how effective this ministerial has been. And I would suggest that against this backdrop, I think the WTO ministerial has given us hope for a system that was under huge stress. I very much concur with the description that Annabelle has made of the package, and with the description that Patrick has made of Annabelle's description. So I will not go into the package, but I want to pay tribute and praise the person of the Director General of the World Trade Organization and the team that she had around her, because having been associated with exercises of this sort, I know how important it is, the leadership of the Director General in getting the members to say yes, to build momentum. Maybe in the past, members were capable of building this momentum, but in the midst of a war that has divided the international community, building this momentum basically fell on the Director General, and she did this. Also, preparing the final decisions that ministers had to make, preparing the agreements, digesting them, pre-cooking them. And this is where I also want to thank Annabelle, because I know how much she's been investing on that, on preparing some of these agreements that at the end of the day could be reached because there had been a good deal of preparation. But I also want to praise the Director General for the huge role she's played at doing advocacy for this deal. And doing this, steering clear of what divided members and always trying to present what unites all the members in this organization, which at the end of the day is what you need to do if you want to get them to say yes. And as we're doing this, and I will end here, Gabriel, so that we maybe get have a second part of the conversation. I want to look at what would be the alternative if this doesn't work.
Thank you.
Because what we are looking at here is essentially having a choice between a multilateral system that is producing some modest results, some a bit more modest than others, some not that modest, I would suggest. But what is the alternative? And maybe in the next part of the conversation, we look at what the alternative would be, because I think it's also, that is also what we need to input into the calculation, or that's what the members of the organization need to put input into the calculation. Thank you.
Thank you, Arantxa. So certainly we keep your question for the next round. And I like your sort of overall assessment that in the current geopolitical context, MC12 gives us hope. And on this, I go to my old friend and colleague, Steve Cole. What's your take, Steve, on MC12 and the results you from the private sector also experienced in governmental issues? Please.
Thank you, Gabrielle, and thanks to Bickel for this invitation. Yeah, I think my value add here is to provide some point of view from the outside, and in particular from the industry. I won't speak more on behalf of the US, even though I was a delegate, but that was some 15, 20 years ago. From the private sector, I'm going to pick up, I'll make 3 points, and I'll pick up where Arantxa left off, which is Dr. Ngozi really was quite impressive. I mean, when she was nominated and as the Director General, she was not a known commodity in the trade community, but I think that was what worked. It really took someone from the outside to come in to really sort of not have the sensibilities, and I don't mean that in a good way, not have the sensibilities of, you know, sort of the trade community of how things usually work. She really did it her own way, and it was very helpful and was very much needed. She was the right person at the right time. She cajoled, she pushed, she, what we say, herded cats, and she did it in a very effective way. And, you know, sometimes from the outside, we've heard some complaints about how she did things. It wasn't the way that's normally done, but it was needed, and the conclusion. So congratulations to her and to all of you for the MC12 conclusion. I will say that one thing that I thought was very helpful for what she did was she, and Annabelle and others mentioned this, she pushed for incremental progress. She put that over, you know, sort of this ambitious goal that has always been part of these ministerial conferences. But we've gotten to a point where the word ambition, when you hear it, it doesn't sound like it is really an intent to move forward. It's almost somebody complaining and saying, well, we don't want to get anything done because it's not ambitious enough. And that's become an excuse, and that's unfortunate. And I think, you know, it's good to sort of turn that around and say, look, we don't have to be sexy. We don't have to be huge. We just need to keep moving forward rather than stay stagnant. And very much appreciate how the WTO really achieved that in this last go around. My second point is really, and this gets to something that Patrick had mentioned. We saw how consensus almost derailed everything here once again. Consensus really is, it sounds nice, but it really is a veto power to every single member. And one person, one country can really slow things down, gum things up. And that happened quite a lot in the past, and it almost happened here. And, you know, it really got to a point where, as Annabelle was saying, it felt so existential at this point. You know, you either get it through or you don't. And if you don't, then that's the end of organization. Well, frankly, that shouldn't be the way this works. It's not a healthy organization if everything hinges on, one meeting or one ministerial conference, and somehow that goes away. WTO has evolved and it has become quite well established, but it needs to take that next step, and it shouldn't be reliant on simple little, not simple, but these every 2 years or so ministerial conferences, and that a failure or a lack of expected movement somehow means the end of globalization. That's just cannot be the case. And so, stability right now is key, and establishment of the organization for the long run is key. And that means, I think someone had mentioned the JSI, the Joint Statement Initiatives. I think that's something that needs to be considered. Gabriel, you and I have had long discussions about this. I've had long discussions with people within the US Congress about this and how this would work and how it fits into the current legal system. Plurilaterals, frankly, countries are much more worried, in my view, of being left behind than said. And so, if there are a small group that has agreed to move forward, I think countries would rather be a part of that than not be a part of that. And so plurilaterals may also be another way, along with sunsets and others, maybe another innovation that should be considered as you consider reforms, because you can get a small group to start talking and then others will join. Momentum does take time to build. It's very hard to get. I mean, I have a hard time getting consensus from my family of 4. So for 160 some countries to get consensus, I think that's very, very difficult. And the last point I'll make is with respect to the private sector. The private sector, in this go around, has been much more engaged than I've seen in the last, I'd say, 15, 20 years. I think part of it is, unfortunately, it felt very existential, and the private sector sort of came to a realization that the WTO helps more than it hurts. And by private sector, I don't just mean the free traders. I mean, the private sector, really, people forget that the private sector also includes those that want fair trade, those that want to ensure, a balance of protectionism and opening of markets. And people recognize that that's important. I think for the private sector, what they realize is useful in the WTO for them is the non-sexy stuff. Market access is very important. MFN, tariffs, it is something that companies, big and small, rely heavily on. And dispute settlement. I mean, being able to resolve differences among countries, between countries, without hurting the rest of the trade, without it becoming a trade war. That's what I think the US-China trade war sort of, became a realization for US companies, that we can't withstand these large trade wars. We need a place where you can resolve differences in a very narrow fashion while allowing the rest of the relationship, trading relationship, to continue. And that's what the WTO brings. And without that, I think, you're going to be back in the chaos of, I think, even the pre-1940s. The problem with the private sector is not often very much welcome in the Geneva community. But I think, Dr. Ngozi changed a little bit of that, but we hope that will continue. The private sector does play a role. It is important. It is a beneficiary, no doubt, but it can be a driver. And we saw that with respect to the innovations that came about from the pandemic. I mean, anybody in the pharmaceutical field understands how amazing it was to come up with vaccines for this, for COVID-19, all within a year, and having done all the testing and getting marketing approval. It's quite amazing the amount of time and effort that went into that. These problems are all global problems, sustainability, pandemic, health, food security, and there's a need for global solutions, and the private sectors does play a critical role. It shouldn't be viewed. The private sector often is viewed in Geneva, I think, as the bad guy. Somehow, profit generation for profit is a bad word. Well, it's not. It's just the nature of the private sector, and also sometimes it's seen as a piggy bank for countries that are not willing to put the resources towards certain things. I think there has to be a balance of views. Everybody has to participate. We've seen APEC do that. We've seen the most recent EU-US negotiations do that with the creation of the Transatlantic Business Council or the APEC Business Advisory. That might be another innovation worth considering. And I'm not saying that civil society is not important. They should also have a role. They've done a much better job of engaging in Geneva. But I think being able to sort of be more inclusive would be good. And with that, I'll end there.
Thank you, Steve. So before I go back to the speakers in a different order, I have 7 sort of questions or items that I'd like to raise with you all, and you pick and respond to some of them or others, some more conceptual, others more technical. So I'll start with one relating to the private sector. And as you mentioned, Steve, DG Ngozi, as soon as she arrived, she invited the private sector in, can you still follow me, or is it frozen? No, she invited the private sector to discuss production, distribution of vaccine and all that. Now we're talking about the WTO getting involved in supply chain more generally. Well, how can you talk about supply chain without directly involving the private sector? So do you have views of how this could be done? It was done very informally during the pandemic. As you know, many governments refused the presence of the private sector at the table. Any ideas of how we can deal with supply chain without the direct involvement of the private sector? 2 questions concern the opting out clause that is so cleverly negotiated here. What happens if a country like China opts out and then wants to opt in, back in? Do you need agreement of everyone, or is it sort of done voluntarily and then you need to accept? Another question concerns the sunset clause in the fisheries, which resemble a little bit the sunset clause that existed for the green subsidies under the SCM, except that under the SCM, only the green subsidies were to disappear if agreement was not reached in 5 years, while here it's the entire fishery agreement. Do you know why? Do we know why? Another question is, what happens if the 6 months of the TRIPS waiver that allows for negotiation on therapeutics and diagnostic, if there's no deal in 6 months, what happens? And the last 3 questions concern what was raised by many of you in the context maybe of reform. Decision-making was not mentioned as such, although there's a footnote, as you know, that allows and repeat that governments can meet and discuss. Why was there no reference to JSI, Joint Statement Initiatives, that are so active and producing good work? And finally, the question of Arantxa about alternatives. If we don't have the multilateral system in a form or another, with or without plurilateral, what are the alternatives? So I will go back first to Patrick and ask him to comment on any of those questions. There was a specific question from the floor about the fact that DG Ngozi is a woman, and she made it essentially. Is it because she's a woman, because she's African, because she's exceptional? Well, I can tell you that DDG Annabelle was also there for the TRIPS waiver, for everything. Maybe because women are better, I don't know, but that's a question we can also throw to you. So Patrick, any comments, disagreement on all of that, or other things I didn't mention?
I shall opt to forego any response to the question, the last question you've just put, leave it to others. On the private sector, I mean, I think it really is, it's sort of a long-standing conventional wisdom that we need the private sector to move things along. And the private sector has been more or less interested at different times, and the membership or particular governments been more or less welcoming. But there is a reality that is always going to have to be managed. Not all the private sector wants trade. There's a chunk of the private sector that really does not want trade. And this was most obvious, in my recollection, in the Uruguay round when we were trying to do something with labor-intensive manufacturers, particularly textiles and clothing, and with agriculture, where embracing the private sector there would have caused us an awful lot of difficulties in addition to the ones we already had. I thought Annabelle gave us a very comprehensive and balanced account of what happened in MC12 and why it should be thought of as having created an opportunity which otherwise was not going to be there. I think the counterfactual, we should not forget what the counterfactual would have been. We would have been absolutely no further forward than we've been for nearly 20 years, frankly, apart from one or two successes along the way. I think it's very important. I think Arantxa's points about contextualizing all of this is exceedingly important. And it's not just so that you can make an assessment of the results in relation to results that were attained at other times, but very much also about where does that mean we stand with respect to the challenges that are now going to have to be faced. And on Stevens, the question of what ambition means is a really neat one. That it's a double-edged sword in the way people talk about it. I think that is important. And I think on the, it's true, we need to think about this. I don't know if we're going to do it today, but decision-making and consensus decision-making and the JSIs raises a number of questions. So far, these things, really going back to the results of the Uruguay round of textiles and telecoms and financial services, they've always been MFN in outcome. They've changed the obligations for the parties who've signed them, and they've changed the rights of everybody. Now, in the e-commerce discussions, there was a lot of subterranean conversation about whether or not we could get a decent e-commerce result without breaching MFN. Now, it's early days because that JSI is we're still working on it, but I think the systemic implications that really need very careful thought.
What do you think, Patrick, of conditional MFN? Is it a possibility? Historically, we've had conditional MFN.
Yeah, but I think, but as long as you've got a pre-commitment, the kind of MFN departure that you might have got in the e-commerce agreement would not have necessarily been consensual. And I think that's the point. Can you get consensual acceptance? If you can, then it opens up another avenue for possible extension of things to go. It's a bit like the question of modesty and ambition. The way I see the JSI, the e-commerce JSI, or for that matter, the multilateral e-commerce discussions is, let's overstep on ambition because we'll never get anywhere. We'll be discussing it 20 years from now. And that's why I think that what is going on right now in the e-commerce JSI, which I've looked at quite carefully, is the possibility of a useful, albeit JSI-based, MFN agreement that can do a lot of work in setting the scene for things that will not be agreed there, that will require coexistence and pre-commitment around differences that will to do with the coexistence with the different approaches, and the sort of light product approach to that is how you get around the MFN problem. But look, I've spoken more than enough, so I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. I mean, there were many questions for you. What do you want to comment?
So let me maybe tackle a few of them, and then glad to come back later. First, on the sunset clause, I think it's an interesting comment that, of course, it resembles the green subsidies part in the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. I think basically what happened here is that when a decision, when countries began to move to the decision of, okay, we will take this incrementally in steps. We will deal now with, one type of subsidies, and we will continue conversations and negotiations on other types of subsidies. In this case in particular, there was a large group of countries, mostly the Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific country, the ACP countries, that are very keen on having disciplines in this area. And they were concerned as to, well, how can we make sure that we actually continue to move forward in this direction and continue to negotiate subsidies in these other areas. So this idea of the sunset clause came about, and I find it quite interesting because I see it as a very powerful incentive to foster negotiations and hopefully reach an agreement in other areas. It is true that members could after 4 years just decide to have this fishery subsidies deal lapse. But in reality, once you have an agreement in place and people benefit from the disciplines, it is very tough to let an agreement, a whole agreement, lapse. So I'm hopeful that this is a technique that will provide an added impetus to find convergence on most challenging disciplines, if you wish, in the area of fisheries subsidies. Now, and this speaks to one point, and several of these questions go to the same point, which is there's a bit of a built-in agenda in a number of the decisions that were agreements that were that came as a result of MC12. One very important one is this this provision in the TRIPS decision that says that 6 months after the date of the decision, that is June 17, 2022, 6 months after that, members will decide whether to extend the treatment included in the decision to therapeutics and diagnostics. And this goes back to the original proposal by India, South Africa, and a number of other co-proponents that they wanted to have flexibility from the TRIPS agreement as it related to vaccines, but also to therapeutics and diagnostics on COVID-19. Now, the provision of the agreement does not prejudge the outcome of that decision. Members committed themselves to make a determination by 6 month time, in a 6 month time frame, but they did not commit to a particular outcome. So that is something that would still need to play out. Now, I think this is a strong political commitment. There is it's not a legally enforceable obligation. You cannot make them decide in 6 months time. But it is a very strong political message, in my view, given the very sort of, the high visibility that this issue has in the context of the WTO. So, stay tuned, more to come, I think, in this regard. And let me maybe just say briefly on the opt-out clause, what happens if countries want to opt in? This is something that was not discussed in the negotiations, and I wouldn't want to, prejudge, preempt any discussion in this area. But I think for now, it's a very clear decision that members who have made a binding commitment to not avail themselves of the flexibilities in the agreement, this is expected to be reflected in a record that is already out there. It's public. It's on our website. And that is, the expectation, I think, of the negotiators. Whether there can be something different, I would prefer to, leave that for the future.
Thank you. I personally think it's very wise mechanism, and it could bring sort of a bit of breathing air. But allow me to push you a little bit, because you were there with the private sector. I saw you on Zoom attending the meetings. Don't you think that things have changed now that we've asked all the private sector to be involved? DG Ngozi was even requested by some members to connect with them to report. how can we go ahead without the private sector, but how can we do it in a government to government forum? Do you have any ideas, suggestions?
So I think the role of the private sector is absolutely critical. I think first they provide the energy, to negotiate many of these topics. Many of these topics are difficult for countries, for governments, for one reason or for another. And the energy of the private sector can actually sort of incentivize governments to take the step forward. And I want to think, for instance, about the instrumental role that the private sector played from across the world. This is not, when I'm talking about private sector, I'm not talking about private sector in, just a few advanced countries. I'm really talking across the board. The role that the private sector played in the extension of the moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions. This was an absolutely critical issue for the private sector, and they came out very vocally in support of this extension. Everywhere from Sweden to private sector from India to the US, to different places in Asia, Latin America, and Argentina. So I think this energy that the private sector brought was instrumental in the extension of the moratorium. But it is true that the private sector, I also think, could play a more systemic role, if you wish, in the organization. And there are many models out there. And this is a conversation that I think probably we in the WTO should have at one point in time. But there's finally another role that I think the public sector can play, and which is critical, and which is an advocacy role in their own countries on the benefits of trade. Because one thing that we have seen, in terms of some of the most fundamental disagreements that I see and that were at play in some parts of this ministerial is, what is the role of trade in growth and development? And what is the role of trade cooperation? And I think the private sector can speak very loud and clear to many of these issues. If you think, for instance, about the role that trade has played in many parts of the world to eradicate poverty, bring people to benefit from the role of trade, and then, of course, to advocate for the types of policies, complementary policies that are required to address any disruptions that may arise from trade. So I see, the private sector as providing the energy, as providing the knowledge, the technical expertise that is required, and also playing a very active advocacy role. And I really think that without the private sector and other stakeholders, I also have to say, it would be, it is not possible, really.
Thank you. And indeed, part of the outcome document and the trade and health has this beautiful reference to further collaboration with international organization. It doesn't say governmental organization and other stakeholders. So it's full of promises for the future. Thank you. Now, Steve, before Arantxa.
Yeah, I'll just pick up again where Annabelle left off about the private sector. I think if there's a way to institutionalize that and a way to make it less ad hoc would be good. I mean, the e-commerce moratorium, frankly, people spoke up, but it took a lot of folks by surprise that it was going to be part of these negotiations, and it was going to be a big deal, that there was even a discussion of getting rid of the e-commerce moratorium. So having something that is not so ad hoc, and I mentioned a couple of other mechanisms in international entities already, but also within governments, there's also advisory roles, advisory committees that private sector sit on. I think the role of the private sector really, especially for the WTO, is less about engaging in the negotiations, but more in providing facts and providing some technical knowledge in order for the negotiators to do a better job in negotiating some of the more difficult, more technical issues. I mean, we've gone beyond the negotiations of sort of big ticket items like the systemic stuff like discrimination. We're not talking about very detailed things. Supply chain is a very detailed area. So is climate change is going to be detailed, and the private sector does have some value to provide in terms of at least helping the negotiators and the government officials understand how it works practically. So maybe that could be sort of the start of that engagement. I will also say that, the notion of trade, it's much broader than I think some people think. It's when people talk about private sectors not supporting, some parts of the private sector not supporting trade, trade covers both fair and free trade. I mean, there's a reason why the WTO itself has the anti-dumping agreement, the countervailing, the SCM agreement, and safeguard agreements. And until very recently, a lot of those, there's very few disputes, for example, in which these agreements actually have been upheld. I mean, safeguards only until recently was never upheld. So I think, that's part of the reason why sort of some of these private sector entities have moved away from it and thinking more bilaterally or thinking more things like America First. But, with a healthy working system that is more balanced, I think you can sort of, again, bring in all of the various views. I'll say something really quickly about the opt-out. As a lawyer, I can't help it. I think it is quite a fascinating structure mechanism. It's really the flip side of opt-in, right? Opt-in is essentially what any classic negotiation and agreement is. I mean, you're opting in to joining an agreement. This opt-out, I mean, it's help save space, give credit where credit is due. I think China really took a leadership role in putting that forward. It could be expanded. It probably is maybe a start of what a JSI could look like. You could have a multilateral agreement in which a bunch of countries opt out, and that essentially makes it a plurilateral. That could be a way for that structure to work. But when you opt in, meaning you join an agreement and then you choose to voluntarily leave, what happens to the agreement? A country either opting in or opting out, I think that's an integral part of that package that got agreed to. I'm not sure that you could unilaterally leave and have no impact on the agreement itself at the end, or unilaterally try to force your way back in and not have an impact on the agreement. The last thing I'll say is, I think it's something Arancha said, security issues, essential security. It used to be, hands off, nobody touches that. This is now a very much, a playbook for a lot of countries. I don't think the WTO should shy away from reviewing security decisions. There is false security. Not everything is essential security, despite what some countries claim. And that needs to be, determined and distinguished very clearly. And I think, having anything be considered a security issue is problematic, and the WTO needs to take a lead role in saying that. And ultimately, the value of the WTO is the rule of law. That's something I think it is the one thing that distinguishes it from, just governments doing their own political ploys and their domestic policies, and that has to be maintained.
Thank you. For another debate, another day, we could discuss the distinction between opt-in, opt-out, and reservation. But before I pass the floor to Arancha, maybe for her to add comments, the private sector is involved in the last three ministerial structured discussions, including in particular the one on environment. And that's a new experience for the WTO. Of course, they're not negotiating, it's different. But could we learn from the TESD? And on this, Arancha, with your fundamental comment about alternatives, I leave you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. I want to make 3 points. One is precisely on the private sector. I think what we are finding out is, we knew this, but what we are now discovering is the value that the WTO has also to convene businesses when the answer is with businesses. Because sometimes what is required also is a better organization of businesses. And let me give you 3 examples of what I think Ngozi, the Director General, has done a very interesting work in using her convening power. One was on access to medicines. Yes, we've placed a lot of focus and attention on intellectual property rights, but we've paid less attention maybe on what is essentially the need to connect the different parts of the value chain. Bringing medicines to many parts of the world is not a function only of intellectual property rights. It's about logistics, it's about cold chains, it's about expanding the production capacity of businesses. So, and the Director General has been very helpful in convening businesses so that businesses would also contribute to building a solution. Second example, logistics. If we look at a big part of both trade shrinking and inflation going up has been a lack of adjustment between offer and demand as a result of logistics not working properly. She has the ability to convene the logistics sector to look for solutions that would help them scale up capacity. Third example, now food crisis, where we need to also put together food producers, distributors, and logistics along the value chain to connect better offer and demand. So I think there is a big unexploited part of WTO in the Director General being the convening force for businesses in WTO. Second point I wanted to raise was on the style of leadership. I think seen now a bit with the benefit of time, I think the difference is in whether you just take a hands-off approach of this being a member-driven exercise or whether you are ready to drive the members a little bit more. And I think this is where, in a way, success lies. Understanding that you have to respect that you do not negotiate for the members, but that you have to be a little bit more than just simply serving coffee and providing for cookies and a cool room where to negotiate. That you've got to push, to prod, to cajole, and at sometimes you also have to shout a bit. Now, maybe there is a nicer way to do that when you're a woman, in that you know a little bit better, maybe how to combine the sweet and the sour bits. And I certainly do think that the Director General has been very good at doing the sweet and the sour, but not letting herself be basically determined by this member-driven nature of a negotiation, which in the past has proven to be deadly. Then third and final, Gabrielle, if I may, on what's the alternative to what we saw happening in WTO. And this is where I want to put a bit of a word of caution, because what I see the alternative be is essentially fragmenting the international system. And this is where we need to be all very careful. And especially this idea that you deplug, you disconnect, you friendshore, you build a system for those that are like you or feel like you or think like you, because I do not think that this is what's going to help us longer term. Certainly will not help those that have less alternatives. And I'm thinking of many developing countries that require an open global economy as a source of demand, as a source of investment. And I do think that fragmenting would just simply make it too tough for them, as it would make it too tough for businesses. Now, it doesn't mean that businesses and countries should not build resilience. They have to. And as Stephen was saying, building resilience to confront the growing geopolitical dimension of international trade is important. But moving from resilience to fragmentation is where I think we should be very careful about, which is where what happened in WTO a couple of weeks ago is a little light, a bit of a guide that in my view we should do well in nurturing for the future, maybe to serve as model for other areas of our international system that requires modernization like the WTO has shown it can do.
Thank you. I have a question here from the floor that is linked to the private sector and to transparency. Allow me to read it, and if any of you want to respond to this or add. The question goes, it comes from Elisa Baroncini. The principle of transparency has a major place in the documents adopted. There's no decision on transparency, but you all know it's mentioned in different places. And the question is, what level of transparency can be considered in the discussions within the WTO concerning the private sector? And is lifting the embargo for WTO documents foreseeable in the near future? In other words, I would add to this question, the private sector has always kept, and that's business, information confidential. If there are problems of supply chain, some transparency become necessary from the private sector. How to reconcile the WTO principle of transparency and others with the principles that animate the private sector? So I don't know whether Arantxa, you want to respond or anyone else?
So let me maybe just
Annabelle, yes, please.
maybe let me just make a brief comment. I don't know if to respond to that, but to add to the conversation, which is to share the example that we've had in the area of vaccine manufacturing. So when Dr. Ngozi came to the WTO, she had a fantastic background in the area of vaccines. And the discussion here was extremely polarized as to, whether you would waive the whole sort of intellectual property regime, or whether you wouldn't do anything in this regard. And she came with this idea that we need to find a third way. And in finding this third way, which was basically trying to help companies and countries ramp up manufacturing capacity, we under her guidance, establish a mechanism to communicate with the 10 largest manufacturers, 10 or 12 largest manufacturers of vaccines. So we established a forum, which we then embedded in a broader coordination effort with 3 other multilateral organizations, the World Health Organizations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. And this connection with this group of CEOs with whom we met every 2 to 3 months to discuss the state of play, to understand how was it that they were ramping up capacity, what were, from the trade perspectives, what were the obstacles to having access to the inputs that were necessary to do that, what were the obstacles, the bottlenecks that they faced on regulatory cooperation, what kind of good trade facilitation measures they were finding on the ground. So it was, an effort for the WTO to identify, to work very closely with the private sector in this case, identify trade bottlenecks, identify good trade practices, to inform our members as to, what could you actually do to make sure that vaccines can reach different parts of the world as they are needed. And I have to say that I found that that experience to be extremely useful because we got firsthand. So, all these things that they were confronting, all these obstacles that they were confronting, and which, trying to sort of motivate members to address them could have a very powerful impact in terms of facilitating trade of vaccines in this particular case. So to me, that was something, a very good way of proceeding. We organized something similar with very large providers of logistics and supply chain solutions when the whole, when we got sort of hit by the supply chain disruptions. And all this, I think, goes to the point of strengthening WTO's role in monitoring supply chains. And I think this was mentioned earlier in the conversation, clearly requires working very closely with the private sector, not to serve, I would say, one particular interest or another, but this idea of identifying bottlenecks and identifying trade facilitation measures, I think is something that could be critical and, quite frankly, very useful for governments as well.
Good, a good solution. I don't know whether Arantxa or Patrick or Steve want to add to this point or other points.
No, I do think that, let me give it a try on transparency also, because I think at the end of the day, transparency is an important ingredient of the trading system, in that transparency is an ingredient to build trust, not trust among negotiators, but trust with the wider public. Now, at the end of the day, the stakeholders of the WTO, whether we like it or not, are governments. And in a way, they are also the ones that decide how transparent, how much transparency should be applied as a function of how much they think this transparency would help in building trust. But let's not forget that at the end of the day, these type of decisions are in their hands. And I know that sometimes that transparency is very, very, very big, very transparent. Some other times there is a space for discretion, because sometimes discretion is what will help, especially in a negotiation. But I know that members then manage this transparency vis-a-vis their own constituencies, which at the end of the day is also a way of building trust with those that are their stakeholders. But I think the time when WTO, or maybe GATT, was a very secretive place where, you know, there was no transparency. And I mean, I think this is over. I have to say, I was very impressed by how much I could follow the ministerial just simply by looking at the website, just simply by looking at Twitter, or just simply by clicking on WTO's website. So the organization has moved a long way into providing transparency, but understanding again that members sometimes want to preserve a space where they maintain discretion needed for their negotiations.
Thank you. So I don't have any other questions. Patrick, please go ahead.
Just one well, I completely agree with what Arantxa said. Transparency, without transparency, we don't have complete markets. If we don't have complete markets, we can't have healthy trading relationships. But it's still a nuanced term. But there's one thing where I think that members are really going to have to work, and the Director General is going to have to lead, is where there is already a commitment to transparency, and that commitment is not being observed properly. And that relates to notifications. The record is abysmal, to be honest. I don't think that's an exaggeration. It really needs fixing. And I think there's a momentum now. It would really be worthwhile trying to push that particular point and see what the holdups are, what the difficulties are. I believe that in some cases there is a genuine difficulty of capacity. Well, let's address it. But I think it needs to become the norm the expectation is that you do it, that you do recognize your notification obligations and abide by them. I think that's a really important point.
Thank you. I don't know whether any of you has any additional comments after an hour and a half. There's a clear link between transparency and trust and the involvement of the private sector. But myself, as a WTO staff for almost 30 years, I would say that the positive resolve of MC12 and the creativity of some of the tools are really, really positive for many areas, not only international trade, for the international psychology, if there is anything like that, or geopolitics. So we need to congratulate Annabelle and the whole team and all those who work, because really, I think the alternative, I thought that we were going to hear this, that is another failure could have been fatal. And now it's positive. There's tons of things to do ahead, but I think governments have trusted each other at least enough to produce that deal, that Geneva package. So on this, I was simply going to thank you all, the panelists, Jolinda, Biko, the participants, and unless there's any other new questions, I will wish good luck to all those who will continue to work from inside or outside on improving international trade relations. Thank you.
Very much to everyone. Thank you, Gabrielle, and to all the speakers. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hi, thank you very
Thank you.
much.